Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we're very happy to welcome Huang to the program. This is your first time on the show, so I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm Huang. I'm a day job. I work as a software engineer, but I suppose I've been trying my hand at political commentary.
And
I guess
how's that? How does that suit you? Is it something that does that bring some passion to what you're doing?
Yeah, I think it does make my life a little more interesting after a day of coding, and I think I find that my day job as a software engineer, I sort of connect important things. That's what I do, and I think when I'm writing, I like to connect two pretty different topics and try to make something new out of that.
Well, I'm looking at an article that you have written for freethepeople.org. The Ottawa protest proves that D.C. shouldn't be a state. And first of all, I got to tell you, we learned a lot. Anybody with eyes watching the whole trucker protest and the way the government responded to that in Ottawa has had a lot to learn. What are some of the main lessons that you can draw from looking at that protest? And then let's apply it to what seems to be kind of a constant minor push to make Washington, D.C. a state as opposed to just a federal district. What did we learn from the Canada protest and the way their government responded?
Yeah, so Canada has a very unique feature in that it is the only federation where the capital is not its own independent administration. It's part of the province of Ontario. So it would be like as if Washington, D.C. is a state. It'd be, what happened during the protest is that the federal government had no policing power over its capital when it was occupied. And that meant the federal government couldn't really function, right? So what did the federal government do? It had to suspend part of the Constitution in order to free itself from these occupiers. And, we have these sort of two bad extremes, right? One bad extreme, the government can't function. But another bad extreme, the government, takes extra power. It froze bank accounts without warrants. People couldn't access their money with no recourse, right? And to avoid that, the solution is you got to give the federal government strong powers, explicit powers that it can't exceed, but the powers are sufficient enough for it to operate independently. And that's what we have in Washington, D.C. right now.
I guess I've never really thought of it so closely, but I see your point in that, look, where there's complete federal authority, it's not a question of should D.C. act like a state or basically the lines are a little bit more clear about the division between federal and state powers. Tell me, why, in your estimation, YZ, why is it that people are pushing for D.C. to become a state?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. There's the sort of cynical reason where D.C. is a very democratic state, and Democrats want more senators in Congress, and also a representative would help. But the other reason is the people of D.C. feel like they deserve a voice in government, which is fair. It's something we've instilled in all Americans, right? They deserve representation. And that's why, actually, in my article, I'm not opposed to representation in Congress. I'm just opposed to D.C. being a state that is independent from Congress.
So tell me, what was the missed opportunity in terms of if Canada had adopted the kind of federal district that we have, would they have had their own police force? Would they have had their own ways of dealing with it short of, I look at what they did, I think it's a terrible overreaction. Would it likely have headed off such a reaction in the first place if they had the means to deal with large numbers of protesters showing up and shutting things down?
Yeah, I believe that if the federal government was able to deploy its own forces, independent administration in the Ottawa, capital Canada, it wouldn't have had to resort to these to suspending part of the Constitution, or at least it wouldn't have had the political pretext to do so. What we found is, one, the Ottawa city government was pretty inept. They just didn't have the equipment to move around these giant semi-trucks. And the second thing is found is, well, Ottawa or Ontario is run by the Conservative Party, which is in opposition to the Liberal Party in Parliament. And the Conservative Party, some of them were sympathetic to the protesters. So now there's a conflict of interest, right? Premier Doug Ford technically has an obligation to help clear the protesters, but politically, well, it gets a little tricky there, right? And that sort of undue influence is something that can lead to sort of these messy constitutional crises.
So how strong has the push for D.C. statehood grown and over what time frame? I mean, you referenced the wisdom of the founders. Maybe we should back it up. Why did they set it up the way that they did as opposed to simply making it, another state in the Union?
Yeah, I think the founders were wise. And if they weren't wise, they were pretty paranoid. Back then, the states were a lot more independent. They definitely saw themselves as more... I like to say they saw themselves more like kind of like the EU, maybe a little more unified. And so the fear of having one capital beholden to one state was, something that would be unacceptable to the other states. Nowadays, that fear sort of subsided, but this principle still remains. We wouldn't want a state, a DC or Virginia or Maryland, to control our capital, right? And in an age of declining political norms and rising polarization, I think it's more important than ever to maintain a independent Congress, independent federal government, and avoid a lot of these tricky scenarios, right? I mean, what if, just spitballing, Congress is passing a bill on some hot topic issue, abortion, gun control, LGBTQI rights, and the governor of D.C., let's say D.C. is a state, the governor of D.C. is that this will, hurt millions of Americans. I can't let this go through, right? And blockades Congress with state costs, right? What could they do? Or perhaps some protesters enter Congress, similar to Canada, and the governor of D.C. says, well, I'm actually kind of siding with the protesters. I won't do anything, right? These are all pretty bad scenarios, and I can't see a solution to this besides, just
There's one solution. There's one solution that comes to mind, but I don't know that governments, either in Canada or here, are likely to listen to it, and that is to stop leaning so heavily on their citizens. I think that would bring a lot of the protests. It'd make them a moot point, but. Things are as they are, and it looks like there's actually an effort afoot to expand, for instance, the influence of the Capitol Police beyond just the Washington D.C. area. I'd love to get your take on this. Where they're opening up satellite offices, I know on either coast. Does that portend good or bad things for what's going on there in Washington D.C.?
Yeah, I think as long as this is done in a pretty clear, as long as the federal government stays within very clear bounds, the federal government should have the power to be able to operate independently, because it's been elected nationally. They deserve the right to independence. I think where it gets tricky is if they outstep their bounds. Right, the founders specifically allotted a district that the federal government, Capitol Police can operate, and when they start releasing satellite offices, it's starting to push that boundary, right? I think there's a myth that there's one dimension of state. The state's either weak, the state's either strong, right? That's not true. I think that's a older view of the state when it was during medieval times. A king was either weak or strong. But in a modern state, you want a state that's strong in the places it needs to be strong, and absolutely powerless in the areas that it shouldn't have power in. And that's what we should be seeking.
Is there a middle ground in here where Washington, D.C. could have legislative representation, for instance, without actually becoming a state?
Yeah, I believe so. And if not, I think that directing that energy for statehood towards an amendment that allows D.C. to have representation without being a state would be a good idea. I think that would be a good compromise, because I think the logical conclusion is that Congress should be able to, do whatever it needs to with DC, which will make a lot of the residents of DC pretty angry, I think a good compromise is to let them have representation, right?
So we've only got about 20 seconds left. I guess I won't ask another question. Let me ask you this. Where can people find you and follow you, either your writings or find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm sort of a ghost online. I think if you visit Young Voices, you'll be able to find my profile and find a lot of very talented writers, honestly more talented than I am. Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay, we are visiting with YZ Huang, and great to have you on board the program. I hope we get a chance to talk again, and I look forward to seeing more of your writings and have another chance to visit.
Thank you so much.
And we welcome you back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome Nicholas Aderinto to the show. He is a Young Voices contributor and also editorial assistant at the African Liberty. And Nicholas, I have to say, this is the first time that I have interviewed a Young Voices contributor from Africa, and so I feel like I have expanded my international horizons just a little bit more. Tell us about yourself, who you are. Tell us what you do.
Okay, thank you very much, Bran. It's nice to be with you this evening. Sorry, okay. Currently in Nigeria, it's evening, so just bear with me for that. So I'm a writer. I basically write on health and education, and I currently work with the African Liberty as an editorial assistant. African Liberty is a foremost African organization promoting libertarian ideas. So I think I would like to keep it that way.
That's wonderful. I'm so happy to hear about people who are using their influence to support and promote freedom all over the world. And I'm looking at an article that you wrote for realclearenergy.org, and this is a topic that I think is going to hit home for a lot of people because right now everyone who is fueling up their car has kind of a long face because the costs of energy seem to be going higher and higher. The title of your article is Building the EastMed Pipeline Would Help Free Europe from Russian Energy. Let's talk a little bit about what this pipeline represents and why it would be important to help Europe stand independent of Russian energy. Where do we begin? Let's start with the pipeline.
Okay. Also, the EastMed pipeline has been in conversation since 2013, and it was born out of a desire to find an alternative to Europe dependence on Russian energy. Currently, Europe is overly dependent on Russian energy, and I think it begs the question how the European leaders allow this to get to this stage before they start looking for an alternative. If we look at Germany, which is the largest economy in Europe currently, is overly dependent on Russian energy, and currently where you can eat Putin the most is the Russian energy. But it's a synergistic relationship. Russia is pumping the energy, and Europe is bringing in the money. If you stop pumping in the money to Russia is going to threaten you with cutting off the oil. So it's a dilemma. That's where the EastMed comes in. EastMed was an initiative to bring an alternative means. It was something that some European countries saw and say, okay, if we can do this, we are going to cut our dependence on Russian energy as soon as possible. And the pipeline connects from Israel, goes through Greece and Crete. Although there have been some challenges to building of the pipeline in recent time, Turkey has been one of the opposition to the pipeline because Turkey believed that they were intentionally left behind in the pipeline. And in January too, the President Biden government withdrew support for the pipeline, and now. Recently, last week, Chevron CEO was saying that the pipeline has to get back into conversation, because it seems as if it's one of the alternative that can work currently now, because from one indication, the pipeline can be done by 2025. And recently, last week, the European Union came out with their plan. The plan cutting Europe's dependence on Russian energy by 2/3 by this year and totally by 2030. But as you said, people are bearing the cost now in the immediate. So that's where the EastMed pipeline stands.
And you mentioned in your article that the U.S. actually declared that it would withdraw its support of the pipeline. Did I see that correctly? Why did the U.S. say that it was withdrawing its support of the EastMed pipeline?
Okay, it was born out of President Biden's initiative for the green economy. So their own administration is saying, if you keep going in this direction, we are not going to cut down our carbon emissions. So this pipeline is not going to be viable. And also looking at the Washington has also argued that the pipeline is not economically viable, because at the past pipeline stands now, there are no adequate funding for the pipeline yet. So those are the two basic reasons that made Washington withdrew the support for this pipeline.
Wow. Maybe it's just because I'm a simple person, but it feels like the whole energy situation, particularly not just Europe, but even America's dependence and other nations' dependence on Russian oil, this could be so much simpler, but it's very complicated. Where domestic production in the USA, where I live, has been slowed down to a trickle. It seems like Europe doesn't have very many alternatives at this point. It seems like there's a lot of power, political power, that originates from access to natural gas and oil reserves. Does that sound about right?
Yes, you are correct. If you look at the position that Europe is different from the position that the United States is in. It's different from the position that some non-EU member states is in, like the UK. Europe cannot do what the US has done. They cannot do what Canada has done. They cannot do what UK has done. It's a different situation. So the old political game is quite complex, and it's looking like the European Union are the one that are going to suffer a big loss, because they cannot follow Washington currently. They can't follow Canada, and they cannot follow the UK with banning of the Russian oil. So it looks like the journey to being free from Russian energy for Europe will be a long journey. It will not be an instant goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, this is bringing the old adage about don't put all of your eggs in one basket. If you trip and fall, you're going to break all of them. Put them in different baskets. So having access to different resources, or having access to different ways of getting that gas and oil, would seem to make sense. But it looks like politics is getting in the way. How desperate is the situation for energy in Europe? It sounds to me like they're the ones who are more or less left with fewer options.
Okay, let me just state some facts here. It's a bit severe situation for Europe, because about 40% of Europe's power comes from Russia. Germany is highly dependent on Russia. The other major source of energy for Germany is the nuclear power. And in recent time, there have been calls to even eradicate nuclear power. So it's looking like when 40% of your energy is coming from a single country, I mean, it stands to reason what were the European leaders looking on for years for Russia to take on of such a level. And when you see, even not for the invasion of Ukraine, Russia already had in plan to even increase this dependence because of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that they were already building to further increase their exports to Germany. So for the whole of Europe, the situation is. And also, when you consider that Russia is currently the second largest producer of natural gas, and also the third largest producer of oil in the world, and when you consider the amount that fossil fuel contributes about 14% of Russian economy. I mean, in 2021 alone, revenue from energy made up 40% of the federal budget of Kremlin, of Russia. So it's a big one for Russia.
Do you see this situation improving anytime in the near future, or will, for instance, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, is that going to have to die down before they can move forward, or can these nations move forward in spite of that conflict?
Okay. Well, it's a dilemma. In the immediate, people may have to bear the brunt. When they say when two elephants are fighting, the grass beneath will suffer. So I think that's what we are currently seeing. That's why prices of gas has gone up. So in the immediate, people will have to suffer. But I believe it's something that we may have to bear up to put to bear a dictator.
Okay, we are talking with Nicholas Aderinto. He's a Young Voices contributor and editorial assistant at African Liberty. Thanks for joining us today, Nicholas. And we are back here on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Adam Shepardson to the program. He is a Young Voices contributor as well as a student at Brown University in Rhode Island. Adam, welcome to the show. Tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Brian. So my name is Adam. I'm an undergraduate student, and I study economics and history, so very much in line with policy and the modern political environment and kind of how we got to where we are and how we can build ways to move forward.
Well, I'm looking at an article you wrote for Roanoke.com, and boy, this is a hot topic, and that is school choice is the solution to Virginia's mask wars. Look, the whole COVID thing over the last couple of years threw a lot of interesting curveballs at us, but I never would have realized or would have projected that people would fight so vigorously over something like masks. And nowhere has that been more apparent than in the public schools. Talk to us about where the situation stands and why is Virginia why is it kind of ground zero for some of these battles?
Yeah, absolutely. So Virginia kind of became the locus of most of the national political debates that are occurring right now in America, mostly over schooling, to be honest. No one likes the school system to be something that's politicized. We all want schooling to be an investment that serves our individual students, gets them to where they need to go, and helps them develop life skills that will serve their goals and kind of help facilitate the system of equal opportunity and socioeconomic advancement that we think is so central to America. So since Virginia kind of became this purple state that became kind of red and its future is still in flux, it really became this, as you said, a battleground for how we hash out the really politically charged debates that are dividing Democrats and Republicans. And schooling is one of them. Masks are one of them. A lot of schools are starting to kind of move away from mask mandates now, but at the time when I was writing this article, it was very much a live issue. So I think that with Youngkin's executive order banning mask mandates, he was kind of taking a hard stand and really kind of solidifying these cultural debates into a political context and a context of law. And when I was approaching this article and wanting to write about it, I kind of thought about, there can be a divide between how we interact with each other politically and what cultural stances we take, and then what we make into law. So I thought that Governor Youngkin was very reasonable in his approach to public schools and saying that, yeah, public schools serve everyone, and they shouldn't be mandating this kind of strange dress code that we don't know if it really prevents COVID. And there's reasonable debate about the efficacy of mandating masks. However, his order, for me, went a little bit far in also applying to the private sector. I think that if we want to move away from an environment where Democrats hate Republicans and Republicans hate Democrats and every aspect of our lives is completely political, then we have to kind of say that there are some areas where we have to live and let live, and we have to allow people to make choices for their own. And I think private schools are one area where people are really just choosing how they want to associate with each other. So the government maybe shouldn't really be involved in that process.
I think it's kind of safe to say, though, that Youngkin wouldn't even be in office, though, if it weren't for the subject of school choice. If I'm remembering correctly, then Governor Terry McAuliffe kind of stepped on his he tripped over his own feet by saying that, parents really shouldn't have a say in this. And boy, it seems like that's when Glenn Youngkin just took off in the polls and ultimately became the governor.
Absolutely. McAuliffe just tanked his entire campaign with that. I totally agree. And Youngkin was completely right to say that parents matter and that parents should have a choice in determining how their kids are educated and what type of education they receive. And that's a totally fair point, and I completely agree. I think that Youngkin kind of steps on that commitment and prevents that commitment from really manifesting in the political sphere when he makes a mandate that affects private schools. So I love his commitment to increasing the number of charter schools in Virginia. I love his commitment to saying that parents matter and parents should decide the futures of their children, how their children are raised, and how their children are educated. Some of those parents are Democrats, too. So some of those parents might want to put their kids in an environment where people wear masks and are masked. And you and I and other people might think, why are people treating COVID like it's a bubonic plague? Why are people so insane about this? But other people don't see things that way. And as long as the people who want to be extremely risk adverse are doing so in an environment where everyone who is, complying with the policies they want to enact consented to it, then I don't see much of a problem in just saying people have a right to be wrong. I'm willing to let people do things that I think are irrational, as long as it doesn't affect me. Live and let live. Let people do what they want.
No, I think you got a very healthy take there. And it's that voluntary nature. Look, if that's what they want, they should be able to do it. But the problem is when we get the state involved and the governor's mandate, for public and private schools is a good example. Once the state's involved, now there's at some level, some coercion involved. So I think you're doing an excellent job of sorting out how, look, school choice matters, but school choice can't be a one-size-fits-all proposal itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that Virginia in particular has a reasonable path forward that doesn't require much change from the current system in order to get to this place where people can make choices that fit with their values and fit with their parenting styles. So Virginia already has a limited private voucher system that would allow some parents to send their children to private schools that maybe fit more in line with what they want out of the schooling system. The problem is that not many students take advantage of this program. It's called the Educational Improvement Scholarship Program. Only about 0.3% of Virginia students are currently enrolled in this. Yeah. So this system, as it currently stands, allows students who apply to a scholarship foundation to receive a maximum of funding, of the funding that is per pupil funding for their district from the scholarship foundation. The problem is that when students actually receive these scholarships, the average scholarship they receive is only about 22% of the average expenditure per pupil in Virginia. So this could show two things. When I look at it, I see, one, perhaps the scholarship foundations are underfunded, and that might mean that the tax credits that Virginia gives to individuals and corporations that donate to these private scholarship funds maybe aren't high enough. Maybe they should be raised so more students have access to a larger pool of money to draw from. And secondly, there might be a problem where individual Virginia school districts have massive disparities in the per pupil expenditures that are given to their public school system. So this might show some kind of troubling implications for equality of opportunity in Virginia. If some school districts have much larger per pupil spending than others, that might say that Virginia taxpayers aren't really getting a great return on investment for the money that they're sending to the state to fund their education system. And I think this really speaks to my argument about how change is needed, and we can work within the system that is currently in place in order to make changes that will help every single parent and every single family in Virginia without respect to things like political affiliation or socioeconomic status.
Adam, are other states looking to Virginia to get kind of a feel for where the school choice winds are blowing?
I would hope so. I think there are always political figures who have ideas similar to school choice. Whether or not they gain much traction is a different matter. I know in Virginia, the Libertarian candidate for Governor, Don Rainwater, had a similar idea about tying tax dollars to individual students, and then every student would have the average per pupil spending in an account tied to them. They'd be able to use that to pay for any school they would like. So those kind of ideas are out there, and they're gaining some traction. Depending on the political environment of the state in which they're being talked about, how far they'll go is definitely up for debate, and we don't really know. But I'm hoping that more people kind of look at these ideas and think, maybe this is a way to both help people and depoliticize the kind of contentious environment that we find ourselves in.
Boy, I think it's a truism. Everything that politics touches tends to become, a real power struggle, and nowhere is that more apparent than this. I like too that you call for even those in conservative-leaning circles who may have some very strong feelings on this should be aware that like you said earlier about the mask, just because somebody else takes a different approach, as long as neither side is forcing the other to do their bidding, let people do what they're going to do. As long as what they want to do is peaceful, let them do it. Otherwise, I think you risk harming your own side by, appearing vindictive.
Absolutely. I think that the best way to approach these kind of issues is to reiterate that consent is what matters, and freedom of association and the ability for people to live life in a way that they think is fulfilling and that they think is in line with their values is really the core of the American spirit. And we should look at every policy with an eye toward making that goal manifest in reality.
Yeah, and people have got to learn to trust the market. I'm going to throw that
Absolutely.
in there. We have trust issues, and that seems to be one of the places. We're talking with Adam Shepardson. He is a Young Voices contributor. Adam, where can people find your writing? Where can they find you on social media?
So my writing kind of appears in articles all over the place and in journals all over the place. You can find me on Twitter to find out where those things get published at Real Adam Shep. And I also have a LinkedIn profile, so either or works.
Okay. And again, he is a Young Voices contributor, so we'll have a link to Young Voices in the show notes as well. Adam, it was wonderful talking with you. Thanks so much for being my guest.
Thank you for having me.
And once again, we welcome you to our final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. Very happy to welcome Jane Bambauer. She is a professor of law at University of Arizona, in addition to being a Young Voices contributor. And Jane, it's very good to make your acquaintance. Tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Great. Yeah, nice to be with you, Brian. So I'm Jane Bambauer. I am a professor of law. My area of specialty, my areas include internet law, free speech, privacy, sort of high tech and innovation. And lately, among the puzzles that I've been mulling over is how to get the most out of the kind of hyper-connected communications environment that we have on social media and just other internet platforms, while also reducing certain types of risks and, pathologies, social pathologies that come along with that sort of technology. And so that was, at a broad level, that's what I've been thinking about for a few years now, and it sort of culminated in this idea that we're going to talk about today.
I'm looking at an article that you've written for lawfareblog.com, Reckless Associations, a new tort for a new information ecosystem. And I think, you know what, you're right. This is very fertile territory, and it's largely unexplored in terms of, all of the information systems out there. Now, being a layman, I'm going to have you explain to me, when we talk about tort, what exactly does tort law include?
Yeah, okay. So tort law, it's most often thought of as accident law. So if two people are in a car accident and one person sues the other, that's a tort. They bring it under the doctrines of their state tort law. It has usually, or at least traditionally, been developed by courts. So it's not like the legislature comes together and figures out exactly what the parameters of these lawsuits would look like. Instead, it's a common law process where courts look at one case at a time and they figure out when liability should be imposed and when it shouldn't. And actually, I think that in a problem like this, where we're still trying to figure out how to handle the risks of a new technology, I think that sort of slow-moving process, that it's very fact-intensive and very case-by-case based, is a good system. So while a lot of, as we're thinking about how to manage behavior on the internet, the natural instinct is to run to legislation to think about what Congress can do. But there is another alternative, and that's to let judges see one case at a time what seems reasonable in terms of human behavior despite its risks and what seems unreasonable.
I like that. I mean, I like that a lot more than the one-size-fits-all approach, which unfortunately I think would squelch a lot of innocent speech, along with some speech that may actually be reckless and harmful. Let's give some examples so that our listener can understand when we're talking about the kind of reckless speech that probably needs to be addressed and perhaps curtailed or even punished. What are we talking about?
Yeah, so for the last few years, I have become increasingly concerned about extremism on both ends of the ideological spectrum. I think the easiest in the sense of best documented examples come from the kind of conspiracy theories that emerge from things like Alex Jones's InfoWars or QAnon and QAnon's various interpreters. So these are communications groups where that maybe concerns that are discussed among the individuals who engage in this sort of group that maybe they stem from some genuine problem in society, but there's like an echo chamber where suddenly all of our worst kind of cognitive biases get involved, and people are sort of encouraging each other to go to more and more extreme beliefs. So again, a lot of the attention, at least in the mainstream press, tends to focus on groups like QAnon. Something similar, I think, is starting to happen on the left as well. And I have to say, to put all my cards on the table. I'm a kind of moderate Democrat, and so I see the signs that something is brewing that looks very familiar on the left side. And so I am concerned right now about, possible violence that stems from just inaccurate beliefs that could come on both sides of the ideological spectrum. And so when people think about examples like the January 6th riot, where because of misformed beliefs about the integrity of our election system, many people were mobilized to go storm the Capitol. That's a culmination of sort of years of incidents that could have been and maybe should have been sort of thoughtfully dealt with or handled earlier. And right now, there's a real mood to force social media companies themselves to handle the problem. But I agree with something you said, Brian, that when there's a one-size-fits-all bill, or in any case, a bill that tries to get the intermediary to do everything right, to find the bad content, whatever that means, and cull it, and then leave the good content up, we're going to have a lot of distortions. We're going to have, I think the most obvious outcome would be that a social media company put in that position will be overly censorial because they will not want to face the legal risk, and they don't get much out of hosting, any one particular person's content. So they'd rather just purge content that might eventually get them in trouble through federal legislation or some other path. So I prefer to focus rather than on the social media companies, on the people who are engaging in the the extremist content and extreme associations themselves. And so that's what I'm suggesting this tort do, is find a path for, like, if someone is if an innocent bystander basically is hurt because of a mob or some kind of frenzied or wrong-headed belief that someone has, and that person commits some kind of act of violence, I would like the person who's harmed to be able to not only sue the person who actually committed the violence, but possibly, if the conditions are right, even reach to central figures in their reckless group. to be able to seek compensation. And the hope, of course, is, the compensation itself is important, but the hope is that that serves as a very specialized kind of deterrence function so that people think twice before constantly retweeting a bunch of theories about how, all Democrats are pedophiles or how every police officer is a fascist, that sort of thing.
Right. I do have concern in that there's some subjectivity, as far as, well, is this extremist content? Because there's nuance. For instance, I do have some serious questions about the transparency of the elections. I have some questions about the integrity of the election system. But I didn't show up in Washington, D.C., and I certainly wasn't, ready to storm the Capitol. I just feel like there were questions that were left hanging. And to some people, that would make me, quite an extremist. I don't think I'm an extremist. At least my actions don't appear extreme. But I definitely think I want more answers. I don't know where, where's King Solomon when we need him? Where do we split the line there between the harmful content and people who may have questions? No matter, I may even be wrong. I'm willing to, I may be totally wrong-headed on this, but I still have those questions.
That's the kind of humility that we all need. So that you're getting right at the heart of what makes me feel the least, the most uncomfortable about this proposal as well. I certainly would not want a form of tort liability that is broad enough to make people feel uneasy or uncomfortable asking questions or even floating theories. In fact, one thing I want to make really clear is that it's usually not even the person who initially creates content that then goes viral who is likely to be the kind of central node. The type of defendant that I think should be, so first of all, I would expect this type of liability to be fairly rare, rarer than defamation liability, for example, and defamation is itself somewhat rare. And I would expect it to be the sort of person who doesn't just ask questions or even present evidence that there might be, for example, an election integrity problem, but rather keeps the drumbeat going, basically shows an intent to keep others hyper-focused on one problem or grievance over and over and over again. And so I don't think it's worth going into the details of how this tort would work necessarily, but what I'm looking for is patterns of communications where someone is incessantly communicating with a network.
I am so sorry we are up against the clock here because I am loving this conversation, and I think we should probably have you back to continue this conversation at some point. We're talking with Jane Bambauer. Where can people follow your writings? Where can they find you on social media?
Well, I tweet at Jane Yakowitz. That was my maiden name. And you can find this piece on Lawfare, as you mentioned.
Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much.